Perfect. Will do.
Okay, Lamia, I think we're going to start because it's already 5:05, and I think 5 minutes is enough for people to. If people join a little bit late, I think they will be admitted as well. Dean Abdel Khali, Dr. Paul Wolf, and Dr. Todd Nicolette. On behalf of my colleagues, Dr. Amal Buzainuddin, Associate Director of CTL, Ms. Lamia Hussaini, Administrative Officer, and Jamal Adi, Research Assistant, I want to thank you for the time and effort you put in sharing with us your expertise on a topic that has become essential for all educators. I also want to welcome our colleagues from institutions in Lebanon and the region. We have participants from 16 institutions who are participating in this session. Now, for the participant, please mute to ensure that we don't have any interference. Dr. Abdel Khali, the floor is yours. Unmute, please.
Thank you, Salma. It is absolutely a pleasure to be here today for this session, and all what it took this session to happen is for Salma Boujawdi and Amal Buzainuddin to ask for it. So it's great to be here. As you probably know, I'm Dean of the School of Education at UNC Chapel Hill, but I'm an AU Byte. I think that's the word that's being used. I'm a double graduate of AUB, and then I was a faculty member there between 1998 and 2000. So it's always wonderful to sort of go back home. I have a pathetic attempt here to do Carolina Blue and AUB Red here, try to sort of keep everybody happy. What's really interesting is people like myself and Todd have been working, trying to launch online or remote or virtual teaching and learning programs for a long time now. And there's always been a challenge for us, which is how do you get people over that activation potential? How do you get faculty who learned face-to-face in person all their lives to sort of try this thing, think about it, imagine it. And one of the things that happened to all of us literally around the world is that the pandemic, the COVID-19 pandemic, literally pushed us over the hill. So here in Chapel Hill, back in, I say March 10 maybe, of 2020, we figured out that we're gonna go virtual. And we literally switched overnight, as everybody has done. And faculty and staff here and elsewhere have been heroic. It was just amazing that people switched overnight to ensure continuity of learning. Many of us, like you, never missed a beat. Not a single course was not offered. Not a single student who wanted to graduate or needed to graduate was sort of deprived that opportunity. And right then, people learned that this online thing is feasible, reasonable, and possible. But it quickly came also to be understood that remote, virtual, or online teaching and learning is not putting your course online. Right? I mean, it's a world unto its own. And when Salma and Amal asked me to sort of think about who could do this, there wouldn't be another person that I wouldn't go to than Todd Nicolette, and I'll just explain in a little bit. So we switched in March overnight to online teaching and learning here at UNC Chapel Hill, and right that summer, Todd, who was just appointed as Vice Provost for Digital and Lifelong Learning, had a whole campus to educate overnight. He went out and literally recruited a small army of individuals, have no idea how he came up with that bandwidth. And he offered every faculty member on this campus who wanted to a 2-week intensive program to sort of like move or help understand what is the pedagogy, what is online teaching and learning, how is the experience for students and for teachers who engage in this medium. So it was just an amazing experience. I'm happy that Todd and his colleague, Paul here, one of many talented people at Digital Learning, are here today. Todd Nicolette is our Vice Provost for Digital and Lifelong Learning at UNC Chapel Hill, the oldest public university in the US, 228 years old. I always have to say that. He is also Research Assistant Professor at the UNC School of Education, and we are very lucky to have him. Todd leads and coordinates our institution-wide efforts to plan, design, implement, execute, assess, and continuously improve digital degree and non-degree residential and non-residential offerings. His team also provides instructional support in the design and delivery of digital academic offerings across the UNC Chapel Hill campus. Before taking on this position, Todd was Vice Dean at the UNC Gillings School of Global Public Health, where he led local and global research and service support units, facilitating effective operations and advancing strategic planning across that school. He also led efforts to develop a digital format for their Masters of Public Health degree, which now has been running for more than a decade. Todd also served as Associate Dean for Operations at the UNC School of Government, where he led the process to develop a digital format of their Master of Public Administration program, a very popular program. He served as that program's first director, overseeing instructors as well as admissions, student support, and career services. Todd holds a Bachelor of Arts in Literature from Eckerd College, a Master's of Arts in English from UNC Chapel Hill, and a doctorate in higher education administration from the University of North Carolina at Greensboro. And I'm incredibly happy that he is helping us frame this session. I'm going to quickly go ahead and introduce Paul as well, so that we can let the session flow. Dr. Paul Wolf is Instructional Design Manager with Digital and Lifelong Learning Operation that Todd oversees. He's a highly motivated educator and a lifelong learner. That's how he describes himself, and he is that. Paul is an adjunct professor at both the College of Education at the University of Florida, Gainesville, and the School of Education at UNC Chapel Hill. His research interests include gamification, game-based learning, augmented reality, mobile technology, and distance education. Paul holds a BA in History, an MA in Teaching, and an MS in Information Science, all from UNC Chapel Hill. He earned an EDD with a focus in educational technology from the University of Florida at Gainesville. I'm looking much forward to this session. I want to thank everyone who joined us, and I have every confidence that you will enjoy and learn a lot from this session. At this point, I'm going to mute and turn my camera off, but I'm going to be here looking forward to engage in this session. Todd, Paul, thank you so much for doing this, and I look forward to your work.
Thank you for that kind introduction. I'm going to talk for just a few minutes, and before I hand it over to Paul to lead most of the session, and you'll see why once he starts talking. What I'd like to talk about is some framing for the work that we'll be doing today, that we'll be working on together today. First, just to build on some of what Fouad described in terms of my background and where some of these thoughts and perspectives come from. While I've had a number of different roles for more than 20 years, I've been working one way or another in helping developers support online courses and programs. And a lot has changed in those 20 years. But I've been part of that evolution, sort of helping see and helping create some of what that looks like. And as Fouad mentioned, the pandemic has been a major shift and forced us to move at a speed and in ways many never imagined, in the face of or sort of spurring what had been a steady evolution and change. So we had been making steady progress of varying paces in varying ways across institutions around the world. But pandemic forced us all to look at this in a different way and have an experience with it in a different kind of way. This session is going to focus on courses, and I think it should. That's a good thing, because that's where the learning starts, right? If we don't have effective learning in courses, we don't have a foundation for what needs to happen in all of our institutions, right? But before we look at the courses, I want to talk just a little bit about where those courses sit, about the programs that they sit in, and some of what we've learned over the last couple of decades.
Please mute.
Thank you. And so some of what we've learned over the past couple of decades, and then also in pandemic, and how that relates to programs, and then ultimately to courses. So as we think about courses and what we've learned in fully online programs, we've known for years that it's really important to be intentional about what happens outside the course. So in addition to creating effective learning in courses, we want to think about the wraparound programs and services. We want to think about how all the courses fit together, how we provide guidance for students as they move from one course to another, see connections between them, and then also support whatever it is that they need to successfully stay in those programs. When you move a program to a fully online format and have the time to think it through, unlike what happened in pandemic, we've learned sometimes the hard way which pieces students support, what kinds of support students have gotten in informal ways, in ways where, because they're just on campus, they're able to get some of the supports that they need, get the information they need, run into each other, go to student advising or student support and be there and stop in at the office, see someone at the front desk, and that's how they find out and ask, well, how am I supposed to do this? I'm not sure what I'm supposed to do. If they don't have the ability to have these informal connections, we need to figure out how they can get that information and where they can go. And it's not obvious on websites always. It's not obvious necessarily in specific course spaces. So there's this need for something in between to make sure that students can successfully navigate that. And in online programs, the intentionally built online programs, we've slowly been figuring out what all those services are and ways to successfully provide that kind of support. Interestingly, in pandemic, we were forced to figure out remote versions of all of those support services for our residential students. So on-campus support units got a crash course in things that we've been trying for a while online, and it was a good opportunity to connect those different teams and think through that kind of work, much like we're doing today as we think about the course space. We're finding, interestingly, that a number of these practices were both more efficient in terms of how they offered services, sometimes more effective, and reached students that we couldn't otherwise serve. So even in this moment of emergency, we've found in some of the supports and that are critical for student success that we have needed, or those adjustments have allowed us to be more successful. We're meeting more students in less time, and those who wouldn't otherwise seek us out are seeking that support or using those avenues. So I believe many of the approaches that we've been using in student support will continue, and we'll be looking at ways to do that. Much like courses, and if we look at the literature of what's most effective and some of what we're going to be working through today, I think what we've learned over this time and tried, it's going to stay. A thoughtful and strategic hybrid approach that's using the best from multiple formats will be proven to have the best outcomes, not just in courses, but in the whole set of services that we need to do. So it's a great chance to really think about, what are students doing? Where are they coming from? What are their needs in class, across classes, outside of class? How can we best meet those needs? I'm mentioning all of this in this framing because a lot of times in my experience, the focus goes straight to the courses, and it's a really hard task, right? So successfully putting courses into a different format is a big challenge. It's a lot of work. So appropriately, we put a lot of focus there. And I just want to make sure as we think about that, as we do that work, that does need to be some of the first work. We also think about where that sits and think about what can we do? What can we take away while we're doing some of that work? A lot of the strategies, a lot of the ways of thinking as we redesign a course can be applied to the support services, to all the other things that are part of a successful educational experience that helps students succeed in class, outside of class, and retain all the way through to the finish of a program. So hoping that some of these comments plant that seed, begin those thoughts as you think about some of the different ways that you need to support students in class and outside of class to help them be successful in whatever formats and modes of instruction you'll need to be pursuing. But for today, we're going to focus on the courses, And for that, I want to turn it over to Paul. Paul?
Thank you, Todd. And I just want to start by thanking you for having us today. I hope this is just the start of many collaborations to come. The 2-week intensive training that was mentioned that we offered to our faculty during the pandemic was not a great fit for all faculty, as you can imagine. Not everyone has 2 weeks to take a course and try to convert their course. So what I'm about to go over with you was my attempt to take that 2-week training and condense it down to about an hour and a half worth of content. So we're going to go through that together, and I'm really excited that we're at a point. I'm hearing from many of you at the beginning of this that so many of your institutions have gone back to face-to-face, because it's a lot easier to think about these concepts that we're going to be going over today when we're in a face-to-face environment and we can sort of envision what an online or hybrid model might look like, instead of being forced into it and scrambling during a pandemic to get your content online. So hopefully it's a more relaxing experience than many of the times I've gone over this presentation in the past. So I just want to confirm, if I could get someone to just let me know that you are seeing best practices in digital course design and delivery on your screen.
Yes, we do.
Yes.
Thank you so much. I can't tell you how many times I've started a presentation and gotten several slides in before someone let me know that they weren't seeing my screen. So I'm sure many of you have had that experience teaching and scrambling to teach online. So real quick, a little bit of housekeeping. I'm going to put this URL in the chat for everyone, but I've put together some resources for you all here at this URL. I'm going to be covering a number of things. This slide deck in its entirety is also at this URL, along with a number of resources I'll be touching on as we go through this. As I mentioned, this is an attempt to condense down a 2-week course. And so as a result, there are a lot of readings and materials that are part of that course. And I tried to call the ones that I felt would be most useful for you to continue to dig into after this session. So for those of you that, if there's anything I touch on that really seems like a good strategy for you, or maybe inspires you to think about how you might offer your course differently, there will be some additional resources there for you. And I'll reference those as we go through. All right. So we've already gone over who I am, but the one thing I just want to point out is that I have been an online student, and I have been an online instructor, and then I also help faculty at UNC design online courses and programs. So I'm coming at this from 3 different perspectives, and I hope that those perspectives will help in that, you know, as a online student, I have experienced really, really positive learning experiences and really, really bad learning experiences in that online environment. And I think that's really important. Similarly, as an instructor, I've tried things that worked really well, and I've tried things that didn't. And I think one of the most important things in all of our teaching, whether it's face-to-face, hybrid, online, is that we are constantly iterating and trying to improve our practice. And so much of that is self-reflection on our own experiences, what we've seen work and what we've seen that didn't work so well. So I want to start off by just kind of hitting our agenda, and then we'll jump right in. I'm going to focus on 2 main areas of looking at this. The first being quality in online course design. So designing a course is one thing, and it takes a lot of effort and thought, and we'll go through some strategies to approach that. Then I want to talk about online instruction. So the actual practice of running your course, teaching it, engaging with your students. And we're going to look at some of the leading theory in the literature as it relates to best practices in online instruction. And then from there, I've got a couple of other theories that I have found personally extremely helpful when thinking about my instruction, whether it's online or hybrid. I'll close with some final thoughts to kind of wrap us up. And then I'd love to have an opportunity to actually hear from some of you, get questions, things that you are finding challenging or have found challenging, and we can try to unpack some of that. So without further ado, let's jump in. And I'm going to throw this URL in the chat as well. But if you could just take a second as we're getting started and go to this poll and just answer simple question. Have you ever taken an online course yourself? And I'll give you just a minute to get to the URL and answer that question. Here in real time, we can see some of the responses. All right. Some of you are still answering. That's totally fine. One thing that I've found interesting is I've given this presentation time and time again, is that this number or this distribution has shifted. If we had done this 2 years ago, 3 years ago, when I asked this question, the no's far outweighed the yeses. And I think what we're starting to see is that more and more people have, even before the pandemic, but certainly during the pandemic and afterwards, as we've continued to have more and more online offerings, more and more people have had the opportunity to have at least an online course, at least one, that experience. And for those of you that did answer no, it is a really important piece of this puzzle. And I would strongly encourage you to, at a minimum, go to a free online learning opportunity like Coursera or something like that, where there are lots of free courses that you could enroll in. You don't have to take the whole course. I know that we're all very busy, but at a minimum, go through some of the content, experience it from the perspective of a learner instead of from the perspective of an instructor. That experience alone is so important, because you're going to see things that are difficult for you, that cause you to struggle, or that create barriers to your learning. And you can think about your own practice. What are the things that you're doing that might create barriers for your students? You'll also see things that really work well. And one of the things that I find anytime I take an online course is I learned something new. I learned something I could try to improve my practice and improve those offerings that I have. So I appreciate you taking the time to answer that question. I'm going to jump into the course design component of this. We do have a fair amount to cover. And to start, I want to talk a little bit about quality matters. I won't be able to go into a lot of detail because you do need to have an actual subscription or institutional license for quality matters. And some of you may have that at your institution, that they do support universities globally, but Quality Matters is a nonprofit organization, and they are really the institutional standard, or the industry standard in higher education for quality course design, and they really focus on design alone. And they break down a number of other components here that you can see that are part of a course, part of an online or hybrid offering. Course design is a component. Course delivery, which we'll touch on, is another component, but Quality Matters does not deal with course delivery. They don't deal with the course content or the learning management system or any of the technology that's going into that course. They really just focus and hone in on course design. All these other things are important and need to be thought about. But with Quality Matters, they focus on the course design, and you can go to their website if you want to learn more about them. They actually are a nonprofit organization that started out mainly doing research in this space. And that was many years ago now. And as this organization grew, it was grant funded to begin with, but it grew into its own entity. And now they really focus on offering professional development to faculty and instructors. They have a number of different professional development opportunities. So if you're looking at going beyond what we talk about today, this is a great place to start. There is a charge for their professional development. You know, it would be like going to a conference or something that you have to pay for, but there are a lot of opportunities on their website if that's something you're interested in pursuing further. But a lot of what they do is offer rubrics and standards and then train faculty on how to use those rubrics and standards. Those faculty then peer review one another's courses and offer feedback to help each other improve. So it's a pretty neat system that they've got going on. And the rubric for higher education has 8 main areas that it focuses on. These are categories. Each of them have subcategories. In total, there are 42 of those subcategories. We're gonna focus today on the first 5. And again, I won't be able to go into detail. We're not really gonna go over the rubric itself, but these first 5 are kind of the low-hanging fruit, I like to think of really doing a really solid course design. So we're going to talk about the course overview and introduction, and then the other 4 kind of come together in a concept that Quality Matters refers to as alignment. And so we'll talk about alignment, and I'm going to walk you through what we do at UNC to help an instructor design their course and make sure it is in alignment. And I'll show you an example of a course that we actually worked on a little while ago. So when it comes to the course overview and introduction, this is probably the easiest thing you can do to help your students from the get-go. If you are offering an online course, even a hybrid course, and you have a learning management system, you have some web presence, one of the easiest things you can do is create a Start Here page. And this is the page you want students to land on when they first come to your course. And a Start Here page really serves to guide a student into what they need to do to get started in your course. Pretty self-explanatory, but so often students don't have this. They may have an overview page that explains what the course is, but they don't have actual tangible instructions as to what to do next. And if you think about it, in an online course, that's really important. In a face-to-face course, a student can just raise their hand and ask you that question. They know where to go because they registered for the course and they were told to go to a specific location for their first day of class. But in an online course, that's missing. And so when you provide the Start Here page, it can be as simple as this. This is the really basic, simple template that we provide to faculty, where basically you let them know to go to their syllabus and get familiar with the course and what they'll be doing in the course, assignments, things of that nature. Go to the schedule and make sure that whatever due dates and readings and things of that nature get added to your planner or calendar, whatever it is that you use to organize yourself, and then go to the first lesson. It could be that simple, those 3 things. I've also seen really elaborate Start Here pages that have many more instructions for students, but something to kind of get them oriented and in going in the right direction in the course is really, really important. And another thing you can do as part of that is an introductory video. So I really encourage faculty to record some type of video or course tour. So this intro video could be you talking about the course, sharing why you're passionate about the course and the subject matter. It could be a screen share of you going through the course and navigating it and showing them where things are. One of the things that we find, and we surveyed our students extensively during the pandemic to find out what was frustrating them, what were their barriers, in addition to what was going well. But one of the most consistent barriers to learning was that they had to figure out where everything was in each of their individual courses. And it wasn't consistent because everybody was scrambling to do it at the same time, and faculty didn't organize their courses the same way. By providing this, you are removing that barrier. You're showing them where things are in the course and kind of introducing students to what the course is all about. So a Start Here page and a course intro video, probably the 2 easiest things you could do to really, really help your students from the outset. I want to talk about alignment now, and then I'm going to pause after that because that'll kind of get us through the course design component. I'll pause then to see if there are any questions. So this is our course design document. It's the second part of our course design document, as you can see. I provided this document on that website that I shared at the beginning. And I will send all the URLs, that website in particular, so it can be packaged with the recording. for anybody that's coming in late and didn't see it in chat. But this is our course blueprint, and it's how we ensure alignment in a course. So the idea is that you map out your entire course. What is it you're going to cover? What are the topics that you're going to cover? What are the learning objectives? What do you want your students to accomplish about that topic? And then how are your materials, the learning activities, any assignments, anything that the students are going to engage with? How are those going to support students attaining those learning objectives? And then how are they also going to set students up for success for any assessment of those learning objectives? And so when we talk about alignment, it kind of goes across the course, but then it also goes, per individual lesson or module. Then it also goes throughout the entire course, where we look at all the learning objectives and make sure that the course level learning objectives are supported by the module level or lesson level learning objectives. So alignment kind of cuts a couple of ways. I want to show you an example because it's hard to conceptualize this necessarily with just this image. So I was working on a drama course with an instructor who she inherited the course. And I'm sure many of us have been in that situation where someone else was teaching a course and then you take it over. The course had been taught for 20 years by another person who retired, and it hadn't been changed much in those 20 years. So she was stepping into this and coming to me and saying, there's a lot of things in here that I don't think necessarily work well. Let's try to take this apart. And so there were 15 lessons that we were going through, and this is an example of one of them. So right at the outset, you can see they're covering both prop and costume design. All of their learning objectives started with the verb understand, which is a tough one to measure. And then the main activity for this lesson was for them to really just talk about their favorite costume in a play. And then for the assessment, they had a paper to write about costume design. So the very first thing that I asked was, why is prop design part of this? Because the activities and the assessment all focus on costume design and don't really ever address prop design or the learning objective that is related to prop design. As I mentioned, understand is a really vague verb. That's really hard to nail down. How are you going to measure understanding? We try, when we write learning objectives, to use far more descriptive and precise verbs. So we needed to really break this down. What would understanding look like? And so we addressed that. This particular activity doesn't really support the learning objectives. It's an interesting and probably fun activity, but it is not something that really was helping students achieve these learning objectives. And then I didn't have access at this time when I was going through and reviewing the course to the actual topic or prompt for this paper. So I wanted to see that to see if it did kind of help with this alignment. So here's what we landed on once we had gone through and redesigned this course. So first off, you can see that those verbs are a lot more descriptive and that we took out prop design. So we're focusing exclusively on costume design. We now have verbs like describe. Describe is very, you can imagine that, right? When you think of what describe looks like, you can think of prompts, you can think of things you would ask a student to do, as opposed to what understand looks like. Explain, create. These are really easy things for you to imagine as you're thinking about activities and assignments or assessments. In terms of those activities, we actually went through and for each of these lessons interviewed an expert in this field to ask them questions about costume design and what they do and what that looks like. So we went to an actual theater and interviewed a number of different experts in these areas. So there's a video with an interview with a costume designer. There's a reading, and the discussion forum actually has them create something that they were shown how to do as part of as the materials that they went through. And then lastly, they have a paper where they are describing the importance of costume design, which directly ties back to a learning objective. The other thing that I'll note here is that we number our learning objectives. This is really important if you're trying to align your course and make sure that each of the things you're asking students to do ties back to a learning objective, because as you're mapping this out, you can write LO1 next to things that support LO1. You can write LO2 next to things that support LO2, so that you're really thinking through in making sure, A, that all of your learning objectives are getting covered in your materials and activities, and B, that you are, that each of those activities and assignments and things of that nature do directly tie back to at least one learning objective. I've even seen, and some learning management systems support this. I'm not sure what learning management systems your different institutions use, but I've even seen instructors go so far as to each quiz question or test question, they put in a little LO1, LO2, LO3, et cetera, to make sure that any question they're asking the student ties back to at least one learning objective. When you map your course out at that level, there's a lot you can do. Not only are you really intentionally designing your course, but there's a lot you could do in terms of learning analytics and mapping out where students are struggling. So if you have your test questions mapped out to that level of detail, then when you see that students consistently miss question 10, and that covers learning objective 2, well, what was the materials that they were supposed to engage with to be successful on the assessment for that specific learning objective? And it helps you so much when you start to get into that level of detail to be able to improve very specific aspects of your course. Now, this is involved and a lot of work. There's a lot of things you can do along the way, and this is a process, right? So I would not expect an instructor to go to that level of detail the very first pass through of trying to get their course into alignment. But over time, you can start to get to that point, and it really creates better learning experiences for your students. It's a better experience for you as an instructor as well, because you know that the things that you're presenting your students and that you're setting them up with are setting them up for success. So here's how it kind of played out. We had our learning objectives that we created. We interviewed the costume designer and made sure that we asked questions that would support those learning objectives being achieved. And then we designed a far more involved discussion forum post that actually addressed those learning objectives. And like I said, we did this for all of the different aspects of the course. So we interviewed a person that represented each of these areas. Now, that may not be a good fit for your subject matter, but this is just an example of how you might go about getting a course in alignment and creating some really engaging video for your students that's not always just you talking. That's fine too, but you have, as we can see here with all the people here, there is a wide range of expertise. I'm sure you have colleagues that may be experts in specific areas of your field. It's an opportunity to show them a different person so that they're not always hearing the same voice, but not always the best fit, of course. So I want to pause here. We talked about course design a bit. There's a lot more that I have here to cover in terms of instruction. So before we get into instruction, does anyone have a question about course design? If anything's come up in the chat, or if anyone wants to put something in the chat as it relates to course design, I'm happy to answer questions right now before we jump into the instruction component.
The chat is clear.
So Todd is well aware of this. My my teaching background, one of my mentors told me, when you ask for a question, count in your head to 30 slowly, and usually the silence will be awkward enough that someone will come forward and ask a question. I will say that once I tell people that strategy, it no longer works. Yes, go ahead.
Yes, hello. So I'm not sure if this question will be answered later, but now that we are talking about this, perhaps it would be good to ask it now. So usually when we talk about online teaching, we all know that online teaching significantly increased the workload of lecturers, of instructors, and so on. Yet we always talk about this perfect course design or this improvements, but we rarely talk about taking into consideration the instructor's well-being. So the course design, does it really take into consideration 2 points, like how to improve this course, but also how to avoid overworking? Because we can always add new assignments or additional assignments, but we also have to take into consideration that there's a limited time for instructors.
Thank you so much for bringing that up. This is actually a component that I addressed when the pandemic was at its height and we were going through this. The mental health of both our students and our faculty is so important. And you're right, it is a big lift. There's a lot of work that would go into this. What I always encourage faculty to do is bite off what they're able to chew right now. Like what small thing might you be able to do as part of this course design process that would improve your course? You know, you might think of it as baby steps. You can't do it all at once. This model also involves support. So someone like myself or someone on my team was actually helping a faculty member with this redesign, and that's very different than if you are having to do it yourself without some type of support, without instructional design support. So you're absolutely right. This design process is incredibly work intensive. And so what I would encourage you to do is really think through what is feasible for you in the short term. What can you do each time you iterate and each time you run this class to improve it just a little bit more? And you may not be able to do the full alignment, full course mapping from day one. That's a lot. But maybe you could focus on one lesson, and then the next time you run the course, focus on the next lesson, and slowly build out a more improved course and a more improved experience for your students. But I can't stress enough, especially with the burden that we all had during the pandemic, all the different things that were going on in the world, all the different, I mean, 2020 was just a ridiculous year for all the things that happened, you know, not to mention what took place in Beirut. I mean, we forget about that because of everything else that happened in that year. But the mental health burden that we were all experiencing, I do just want to stress that you have to take care of yourself above and all else, right? One of the nice things, though, is that now that we're going back face to face, you know, Todd was talking about a hybrid approach and finding those pedagogical or those strategies that work well for online versus face to face. And you can kind of pick and choose a little bit. And that's really, we're at a place where you can just decide that this component of my course might make sense to put into an online space. And I'm gonna bite that small piece off. And then the rest is going to be face to face, but you're creating more and more opportunities for your students.
Well, I wanted to jump in.
A couple questions have come in. Are there important differences in the design of a totally online course and one that is blended or hybrid? And what are the main considerations to keep in mind? And yes, there are definitely differences. With an online course, you really want to, in an ideal scenario, have everything kind of packaged in that LMS. You want most things to be laid out ahead of time and planned out ahead of time, because your students in engaging in an online course are often going to have the opportunity to kind of browse through all that content, get a little bit ahead if they need to. One of the beautiful things about an online course is that it provides that flexibility for students to look at their schedule, you know, whether it's work or family, you know, if we're talking about adult learners, and fit in when they're going to do the course content. So you really want to plan that out in advance. With a hybrid course, you know, you're still going to be teaching some components of that face-to-face. And so there is, by the very nature of that kind of setup, there are going to be some things that students won't have access to until they come into that face-to-face space. But you can provide them certain things in the online realm, we'll call it. So I've seen hybrid setups that don't, you know, build out every lesson because there's not necessarily a need for that, but they do provide certain resources in an online space. So maybe those resources are the readings for the course and some videos that are pre-recorded that students can go and look at. You can flip a classroom where maybe you've pre-recorded some video, but when they come to your class, you're going to actually do the practical things that used to be homework in the old days. So there's things to think about. Hybrid typically doesn't require quite as much advanced planning. because you're not putting everything online.
Paul?
Can we do the beginning of each session an outline orally or on a PowerPoint presentation? What are the main tasks and their objectives? So if you mean each session like a class session, that model seems feasible to me, that you could do something like in a PowerPoint presentation, an outline where you go through the main tasks and objectives. And certainly that also brings into question and we'll talk about this, we're about to go into online instruction. It brings into question some things like, what you provide synchronously, face-to-face like we're doing right now, versus what you provide asynchronously, pre-recorded, things like that.
Paul?
Okay, so this is an important question. When an online course is produced, can it run freely in future semesters without the instructor? So this is an important consideration when you're designing a course. Is it possible? Yes. But you also have to think about the fact that a big component of an online student's experience is going to be engaging with you as the faculty member and getting feedback from you. You can do, and there are lots of examples of this. If you go to Coursera, most of those massive open online courses that they have there just run independently. And you could take all the content, everything's pre-recorded, everything's auto-graded, and that is an option. And in some learning situations, that might be the ideal, particularly if you don't have the time to run a course. But I was just working with a faculty member that wanted to do that, and what we ended up deciding after we went through the design process is that at a minimum they would have a graduate teaching assistant actually going and running the course for them. And that's a model I've used several times as well, where the faculty member is the expert. They create all the content, they record the videos, but then a teaching assistant, a graduate teaching assistant, then runs the course, is in the discussion forum, responding to people, that type of thing.
Paul, I wanted to build on two of your answers and add some more perspective to those. Some of that last question and how it connects to a previous one. A lot of times I hear administrators and faculty talk about online versus face-to-face, and it carries a lot of assumptions about what online means and about what face-to-face means. So I think it's also helpful to think about, well, what are the ways that instruction's happening in that online format? Because there are actually a lot of different ways to do online. And sometimes as we think about hybrid in particular, what's most effective and most connects with the literature of what's most effective has more to do with what's asynchronous and synchronous. What are people doing on their own time, and what are people doing in live sessions together? And so you could do fully online that has lots of synchronous, that has lots of things that feel a lot like a traditional face-to-face in-person class, yet it's fully online. So I would just caution as we think about online to make sure we're thinking about, well, which version of online are we doing, and which version do we want to do, and why do we want to do it like that as part of that design? I also wanted to go all the way back to the first question from Leanne Said. That was a great question for a number of reasons, and Paul was talking about the importance of this process of building and being realistic and reasonable and humane about what anyone can do in this, and thinking it more of an iterative process. Wanted to underscore how important that is, and from the administrator perspective, that yes, we need to be realistic about what that means, and that this is progresses over time. Also wanted to address a different element of that question, especially since I've seen this happen a lot in courses and programs as they get developed. A lot of times when we add, or when we create an online version, we do it in an additive way. We get excited about the things we learn by working with an expert like Paul, and like, oh, I could do this and that, and I make the changes, and we add things into the course. And we're adding more things. We're not replacing, we're not changing, we're adding it in. That's going to be a great burden for the student. And then suddenly we have a course experience that's actually much bigger than was originally envisioned for the number of credit hours that are intended or the learning objectives. It also is a much bigger burden for the instructor. And it gets back at that original question of like, what's realistic, what's good for the mental health. So some of it's about how you build it and making sure that's reasonable. Some of it's thinking through that balance of who's doing what, and is that realistic both for the student and for the instructor in what you design, and including that in that design exercise.
Thank you, Todd. And one of my favorite sayings when I'm working with faculty and just in life, as I engage with life, is don't let perfect be the enemy of good. And you can look at all of this that I'm going to cover today and feel overwhelmed. There's just too much. This is too much work. But again, that's that perfectionist. I'm going to do it perfectly. If you don't have the support of an instructional designer, that's really not reasonable to put on yourself. But there are small things that you might be able to do and replace. Again, as Todd was saying, take something out and replace it with a new strategy and try that out. And you can do small incremental change. So let's talk about instruction, because I think some of the questions were starting to speak to instruction and how a course would actually be run. And so there's a few things to talk about here. The first thing I'm going to go over with you all is the community of inquiry framework. In the literature, this is really the dominant approach as we think about online instruction in particular. There are 3 realms we're going to go through, and then we'll come back to this graphic. But we're going to talk about social presence, cognitive presence, and teaching presence real quick. So when we talk about social presence, what we're really thinking about is the fact that students are engaging with real people. They're engaging with each other. And the sense that a student has in your class that they're kind of sharing that virtual classroom space with other real people. So there's a lot of things that we can do to set up a good social presence in a course that I'll talk about in a second. But when you have a strong social presence in your course, you'll start to see things like your students will share emotion and talk to each other, say in a discussion forum, as if they were having a real conversation face to face. If they're calling each other by name, for example, and having sustained conversation that has real back and forth and not just an initial post and a response to that post. So there's a lot of things you can see there. If you see students, assuming it's appropriate, starting to use humor or joking around, that's a good sign that there is strong social presence in your course. So what are some things you can do to create social presence? First is you can encourage students to introduce themselves. I like to, in every course I teach, I have a introductory forum post that would work in a hybrid or a online setup, where I give specific prompts. I ask students to share some specific things and respond to each other. And what I find when I do that is that it's a low stress factor in terms of a discussion post for their first post. It gets them comfortable going into the discussion forum and posting. It creates a space where students start to see shared experiences because of the prompts that I ask. And so I might ask a student to let me know why they're excited about taking the class, what their favorite hobby is, depending on when the course is run, what was their last vacation, some very specific things that forces them to share a little bit, not overshare, but just a little bit. And students will start to find connections. And that's when you start to see real conversations happen, like, oh, you play guitar, I play guitar too. Or I'm so happy you shared a picture of your pet. Here's a picture of my dog. The types of things that start to happen that you see students making a connection like they would if they were sitting down and having a lunch together. I like to design my discussion prompts, and we're going to spend some time today, by the way, really focusing on discussion prompts. But I like to allow students to bring in their real life experiences and identities. And then I personally always go in and introduce myself and model the type of welcoming attitude I would want students to engage in as well. So I answer those questions too, and I let them know a little bit about me. And we'll talk about some more strategies for that a little bit later as we dig into really student engagement and how you engage with your students. The second piece of this theory is teaching presence. And so this really speaks to that last question. This is a student sense that you are present in the course. and it's important for a positive learning experience. You can automate feedback, but it's different when someone is actually running the course and providing, personalized feedback to a student. There's a lot that you do, as we have alluded to, that goes into running an online course, designing it, everything, that a student may never really think about or see. So how does a student see you in the course? So this is, you see here a little screenshot of someone providing comments on a paper. So that would be an example of a student visibly seeing your work, your presence in the course. I've definitely taken an online course before where it felt like the teacher was not there. Everything was auto-graded. They never really did anything to show that they were present in the course. Things were all pre-recorded. That is something that I think is really important for you to think about if you're running an online course, is how will students see you, and how often? And there are things you can do to minimize how much effort it takes on your part. So for example, one of my favorite things to do is, instead of getting into the discussion forums each week and responding to every student, because that's a huge burden, especially if it's a big class, what I like to do is summarize the discussion forum at the end of the week in a short video, 3 to 5 minutes. I talk about some of the things that I saw, if there were any concepts that were students seemed to be really struggling with, I clarify. If there were any themes that really emerged naturally in a discussion forum, I'll talk about that. If you're not doing discussion forums, you might do a short, quick summary of what students should have learned over the past week, and then set up the next week. I mean, there's a lot of little things you could do quickly that show students you're there, they see you, they hear you, but it's not the type of thing where you're in the course constantly trying to engage with every student individually. I'm a big fan of personal feedback on major assignments. Not every forum post, but certainly if they wrote a paper, I would want to go in and give each student some personal feedback there. One thing that I've seen some success with is faculty that are using audio comments instead of writing something up. They'll read the paper and record themselves giving some feedback and attach that. Depending on your learning management system, that may or may not be an easy ask, but some LMSs these days do have that built in as a feature for you to provide audio feedback. Cognitive presence is really more about students engaging kind of with the material. You might think of it that way. There's a number of ways students can engage with the concepts in your course by having dialogue with you or each other. So there's a few strategies that I felt were particularly helpful in this book, Effective Online Teaching. These come from chapter 11 in that book. But group deliberation, where maybe you present a topic and allow students to talk about it. Maybe they're debating, maybe they're just discussing, but that can be a really good way to introduce cognitive presence. Some type of problem solving is generally going to force students to kind of use those higher order thinking skills, generating and testing hypotheses, and reflecting on aspects of the course content that you're presenting. So there's a lot of ways that you can introduce cognitive presence. But these 3 areas, and we're going to dig deeper now into this kind of concept of how students are engaging in your course. But these 3 areas, according to the Community of Inquiry framework, really represent the total educational experience. And you can see in this Venn diagram how they interact with one another, and how they kind of play off one another to create a positive educational experience for your students. So let's talk a little bit more about what student engagement actually looks like.
Paul, can I jump in, Paul? I'm raising my hand just to let you know that Natalie is saying social presence strategies lead to an aced lesson.
Natalie, could you unpack that a little bit? Explain to me what you mean by aced lesson. if I'm interpreting it correctly, it sounds like you're saying that when you incorporate social presence strategies, you're going to have students do better in the course. But I just want to confirm that that is what you meant. Feel free to respond in chat if that's easier.
I meant that an ACE lesson is more active. The students are more active, more energetic, more communicative.
Absolutely, yes. I think that's when you see that in your course, you see students more engaged and you see students participating more.
The Montessori strategies.
Absolutely, that's a good example. The Montessori strategies certainly are trying to create more social presence, but also more cognitive presence, I think, in some of the approaches they use. But so the community of inquiry framework is one way. I'm actually gonna answer that question in a moment, the question about students turning on their videos. But the community of inquiry framework is one way you could think about student engagement. Moore's model of interactions, a more simplified approach, but you could think about the fact that students are going to be engaging with three main aspects of your course. They're going to be engaging with the instructor, they'll be engaging with other students, and they're going to be engaging with the content, whatever that content looks like. Another way you might cut up student engagement and think about it in your course is when we think about modalities, which we touched on earlier. You know, what engagement looks like when we look at, say, an asynchronous online course, that's going to be very different than, say, a synchronous online course or a synchronous in-person course. So all of these different modalities are going to play into your decisions about how you design your course and then interact with students and set up interactions so that students are having a more engaging experience. So I'm going to go over some strategies as it relates to student engagement, because this is probably the biggest thing that I took away during the pandemic from faculty, is that they felt like when they moved online, students were less engaged. I think it's important to recognize that those courses in a massive quick shift to online were not intentionally designed for online, and they weren't optimized to create engaging experience for students. And also, we all had a lot going on. So I think if we take the pandemic as our model, we're doing a disservice to this type of education that can take place. It's impossible to expect your students to be really, really engaged when they're having family members potentially sick in the household, or family members dying as a result of a pandemic, or other things that were happening. So I think we probably shouldn't put too much weight on what engagement looked like in the pandemic, and think instead about what are some strategies that would encourage and increase engagement in an online or hybrid setting. So a few things I just want to say at the outset before we get into some specific strategies. First is that high tech is not always a good solution. We have a tendency in education to kind of rush to whatever the latest thing is and try to use it without really thinking through how it benefits the learning experience and how it's going to actually improve that learning experience, when there may be lower tech solutions that work just as well. And we'll talk about that a little bit. Far more important than the technology being used is the pedagogy and the andragogy that is informing the decision. And so thinking through, optimizing those experiences for your students instead of just rushing to the technology is really important. We've talked about course mapping and planning. Some degree of that, maybe not at the level we looked at earlier today from the outset, but some degree of course mapping and planning is really important, so that you've thought through, everything that's going to happen in the course, and remembering again that engagement looks really, really different when we look at different modalities. So let's look at some strategies. My favorite what does andragogy mean? So andragogy speaks specifically to adult learning, and in a higher education setting, we're dealing with adult learners, and that just looks a little bit different than what you might think about when we think of pedagogy, which technically is referring to younger learners. Those two terms often get used interchangeably. So I like to go to discussion forums because it is a really low barrier for creating some engaging experiences if it's done right. And it's also probably the most common thing in a learning management system. Every learning management system has a discussion forum, some type of forum opportunity. It's a great way to create some way for your students to engage with each other and with the content. And I often hear from faculty that they've tried discussion forums and students weren't engaged. So I just want to say at the outset that the majority of the time when I unpack that with a faculty member and we really look at their forums, the reason students aren't engaged is often because of how the forums are presented and designed. And so I'm going to give you some strategies to create engaging discussion forums. All right, so first and foremost, here are some reasons that a discussion forum is a good way to create an engaging experience. First of all, we all know it. We're used to it. If you've taken an online class, there's some type of forum 9 times out of 10. Your students know how to do it, you know how to do it. And so there's a low barrier in terms of cognitive load, which we'll talk more about later. It's actually one of the really cool things that came out of the pandemic is that because there were more and more opportunities for students to engage with each other in a forum, which is asynchronous, students can really think through their responses. It's actually really good for introverts who in a formal classroom setting, if you were to ask a question right then, introverts need time to process. They need time to think through what they would say. I often hear from introverts that they will think of the perfect response, 3 hours later. But in that moment, it puts a lot of pressure on them. In a discussion forum, you're going to see both introverts and extroverts able to communicate because the extroverts can just respond right then. And an introvert has that time to process, think through, and write up a response. So you actually will see more participation sometimes from introverts that wouldn't have participated in a face-to-face class. It's really easy from an instructor standpoint to see who was participating in the discussion. That's a little harder in a face-to-face class because it's happening in real time, and then you need to remember who it was that was participating and how much, as opposed to a discussion forum where it's right there, right in front of you. You can go through and see exactly who participated in the discussion. And then, of course, it's flexible, it's schedule friendly. I could be working a full-time job and still get to participate in the discussion forum if I wasn't able to attend a normal class session. I could have a family and do this in the evenings or on the weekends. So it opens up educational opportunities to more people. So here's some tips. First and foremost, this is my #1 tip to faculty. You should not have a right answer. And so what I mean by that is if I ask a discussion forum question and it's, a math equation, what is 2 + 2? There's a right answer to that question. And every student is going to say the exact same thing. That's not a discussion, right? That there is a place for questions that have right answers, but a discussion forum is not that place. A discussion forum is not going to generate a discussion and a conversation. That's really what when you're thinking about a discussion forum, you're trying to create a conversation space for your students to have a discourse about a topic. So one of the things I like to do is to create an actual conversation is to try to incorporate some type of practical application of what it is that they're learning. Have students apply what they're learning to a real world situation, for example. Or if that's not possible, tying a discussion to their lived experience, their personal experiences and interests, where they're sharing something very unique and personal to them, that is going to generate discussion and unique responses. And then if possible, and it's not always the perfect fit, but if possible, I might ask a few different questions and let them decide which ones they want to answer. That also is going to generate some different responses so that you're not having all students say the same thing. Most of the time when I talk to a faculty member and they say students aren't engaged in the discussion forum, this is the biggest takeaway that we have as we dig into their discussion forums, is that they didn't set up the discussion to create a conversation. So one of the things that I also see is that expectations aren't set. So if you don't tell students that you want them to respond with an initial post, and you don't tell them that you want them to respond to at least 2 of their peers, well, you're probably not going to see students doing that. Now, if you design your discussion forum well, you will probably see some students responding to a lot of their peers just by the nature of the conversation you're creating. But if you expect them to respond, you need to specify that and let them know that. You know, graduate students might be a little different than undergraduate students as you think about how much you want to kind of dictate exactly how many replies, but you still want to think through these questions. You know, are you going to have some type of length requirement? And when it comes to writing quality, do you expect it to be formal or informal? You know, I've taken classes where the faculty member expected students to actually cite sources and write in a formal manner in the discussion. That's fine if that's the direction you want to go. I will just caution that does limit discussion a little bit. That's going to probably take away from that conversational element. When I teach classes, I let my students know it's an informal space to be talking about the content. And I don't want them to get burdened down with you know, citing sources and things. We had readings that we read that week. They can just reference, you know, the title or the author. They don't need to actually go into the bottom and cite the source, because I want them to have a conversation and be and remove barriers to them posting. But you can do it either way. I've seen it done both ways. It can work either way. And the other component is often to generate discussion, it's helpful to set an initial post deadline. So I want everybody to post their initial original post by Wednesday of the week. And then I want everyone to respond to at least 2 of their peers by Sunday. And when you set up 2 deadlines like that, it creates a moment where all the posts will be there on Wednesday for people to then respond to. If you don't set those 2 deadlines, sometimes what you'll have happen is that students wait to the end of the week to do their initial post, and then it's difficult for a conversation to actually take place. This is true of discussion forums, but I would say it's true of most assignments. I'm a big fan of rubrics. Providing a rubric to students, it really shows them what you're looking for, and sets those expectations. And then where possible in the forum, elsewhere, incorporating your own enthusiasm. Again, you don't need to respond to every post, but where possible, if you can get in there and be engaged as well, then that's going to just encourage students to also engage. A couple other things. Like I said, doesn't mean responding to everyone. There's some different strategies you can employ there to make it so that you're not feeling like you need to respond to every student. One thing I like to do is I'll go in maybe a couple days into the discussion forum and read through what's been said. I might ask a clarifying question to the whole class in the forum, or use the Socratic method to just ask a very quick question that then would ask a student to then, you know, respond to my question. But it forces the student to continue to delve a little bit deeper into whatever that concept is. Of course, playing devil's advocate, where you take a contrarian viewpoint, even if it's not your own, to generate discussion and force a student to think a little bit more critically about whatever it is you're talking about. And then, of course, correcting any misunderstandings you see. So I've included a number of other things. Some of these we've touched on a little bit already. And one of the things to really think about as well is, if you've got a really big class, sometimes it's useful to break students into smaller groups. Because if you have 100 students, 300 students, that discussion is going to get really, really untenable. You're not going to be able to navigate a discussion of that many students at once. So generally speaking, if you've got a class that big, I might break students into groups of, say, 20 or 30. And that way the discussion is a little bit more manageable, and you've got multiple discussions happening. It also really reduces the number of kind of similar posts that might start to happen with that many students. So a couple of prompts to think about. I like, as I mentioned, to do some type of introductory forum at the outset, but you can also do other fun prompts. I had an instructor once who each week they had a fun prompt that was not related to the subject matter, but was just a place for students to be connecting and socializing a little bit. And so she might ask, you know, what's a movie everybody is watching right now, or that someone is watching right now that they would recommend. And then you have students talking about the movies that they've been watching or their favorite movies. One week she might ask a question about, you know, the latest Netflix show that students are watching. Whatever the case may be, she had a fun prompt each week to have them just have a space to have fun and engage with each other. And then she also had a prompt that was related to the subject matter. With the fun prompt, there's no requirement, there's no expectation. It's just come in here and engage if you want to with one another. But it does create a space where students can have those kind of informal conversations that they would have maybe had in the hallway outside of class. You can also create prompts that are more around brainstorming and idea generation. So there's no right answer, right? You're asking them to think about something and share their own ideas. That can create a lot of conversation, much like you might have in a meeting for work where you're brainstorming something and writing it up on the whiteboard. Debating, so maybe you assign a certain group of students one side of an issue and another group of students the other side of the issue. That obviously is going to create a lot of conversation and back and forth. I've also seen a lot of success with role playing or scenario-based situations where you ask them to assume some type of role, or you present them with a scenario that they then need to unpack or solve or engage with in some way. So there's a lot of creative ways that you can create forum posts, forum prompts that really do encourage that communication. And again, it won't be a perfect fit for every subject matter, but for subject matters that do lend themselves to this type of discourse, it really can help create engagement in your class. Some other things I've seen work really well in terms of engagement, scavenger hunts. This is often used at the beginning of a class where you may want students to find certain things and make sure that they know where certain things are, or that they know what certain expectations are. So I see a lot of syllabus scavenger hunts where you maybe set up a quiz and or a worksheet of some type that students need to answer questions. You know, how many assignments are there, or how many papers are there in this class? How many exams, things like that. So students have to go through and actually read the syllabus to answer the questions on the scavenger hunt. You can also have scavenger hunts that involve students collaborating together. Little Easter eggs. So by this, Easter eggs is often used in video games and movies as a term to describe something that is kind of hidden in the background, a hidden little gem in a movie or a video game. What I've seen instructors do sometimes, I've actually only seen it once, but he was filming his lectures and he did it in his office at his desk, and he changed what was on the shelf behind him for each video so that at the end of the semester, if you had watched all the videos, then you could answer a certain question based on what he was changing behind him. So those little Easter eggs force students to kind of engage with the materials and watch those videos. And then he offered extra credit for students that had obviously watched all the videos. I'm a big fan of alternate forms of assessment. So one of the challenges we had in the pandemic is that a lot of times the assessments we might have used in a face-to-face class didn't translate well to online. Let's say you were given a multiple choice test and now you're given that multiple choice test online, but if you don't have any form of proctoring, you're putting a lot of trust in students that they're not going to cheat. And we actually did see more cheating during the pandemic for a lot of reasons. I mean, I think students were under a lot of pressure. They may not have been able to study as much as they normally would. They might not have been in environments that were conducive to studying because they were forced to go home. So there are a lot of things to unpack there, a lot of factors that contributed to that. But if you use alternate forms of assessment, things like portfolios, journals, podcasts, video blogs, or blogs themselves, where you're not asking students to take a multiple choice test, it's a lot easier for you to see the student's original work in those contexts. So I really encourage faculty to think about their subject matter and how a student might represent that they had achieved the learning objectives in an assessment of some type that was a little less traditional. These also present scenarios for students where they actually they get to do something a little bit more personalized, which by that very nature is going to create a little bit more engagement, a little bit more ownership of whatever that assessment looks like. And then lastly, there's a tic-tac-toe activity that I've used in the past that I'll show you. I will say this one requires a little bit more work on the part of the instructor. So if you're already feeling overwhelmed, this one may not be the best option for you, but it allows students to have some degree of choice, and that can often increase engagement when it comes to engaging with the material. So here's what that looks like. So what I've done here is given some examples using Bloom's taxonomy. So we've got 3 things that might demonstrate knowledge, and they all speak to a learning objective. We've got 3 things that would force a student to analyze. That's moving up the Bloom's taxonomy into higher order thinking. And then we've got 3 things that would force a student to evaluate or create. And they're all different, but they all kind of accomplish the same thing. So we won't read through all of them, but the idea being that you've presented students with a few different options of how they might address or demonstrate that they have learned the learning objective, and you have them choose one thing from each row. So if I have a really creative student that likes to express themselves through maybe art, then maybe they pick to write a rap song, create a graphic, and then do a portfolio, right? So they've gone that route. But maybe I've got a student that's a little bit more traditional in terms of the types of assignments they like to do. And that student is going to identify something on a pre-created diagram, write a persuasive essay, and keep a journal. So you've got options for students. And when you give students choice, as we'll find out a little bit later when we dig into some of the theory, when you give students choice, you will often see more engagement from those students. But again, this would require you to create 9 different assignments that you would then need to be able to give feedback on and grade instead of 3. So I would say approach this with caution. It's a great activity for students. It's really great for them, but keep your own mental health, keep running with that theme. Keep your own mental health in mind when you think about something like this. You also could cut this down to just be 6 assignments, and they have 2 options for each. There's a lot of ways you could approach this. So discussion forums and some of those other different ways that you could create engagement through assignments and activities. That's one side of this coin. The other most common thing that I see is synchronous video sessions. And this is going to speak to that question about, do you have students turn on their video? So the synchronous videos or synchronous class sessions, very, very common. It's an opportunity for you to connect directly with your students. And I got this question all the time from faculty. Should I have my students turn on their video? My question to them was, why are you having students turn on their video? Is the reason you're having them turn on their video because you want to make sure they're there and paying attention? Kind of thinking about it in terms of that classroom face-to-face model. Is it because that's how you see students engaging? Because there's a lot of reasons a student might not want to turn on their video. And I think if we're trying to be compassionate educators, a student, especially during the pandemic, I mean, that's a unique case, but they may not be in a situation where they want to show everybody what's going on in the room with them, what's behind them. They may have a poor internet connection. And if they're streaming their video, that's actually going to cause them to not have as good of a learning experience because it might put too much bandwidth on their internet connection. And there are strategies you can use to still show that students are engaging, even if their video is off. And so I would say this is a question you certainly need to think through, but think through it, fairly intentionally. Whether or not you would require students to turn on their video is a decision for you to make in your individual course. My general rule of thumb is that I don't require students to turn on their video when I teach. And we can talk, certainly as we get into the Q&A towards the end, we can talk about some of the pros and cons there. But here are some things that you can do in Zoom or whatever web conferencing or video conferencing solution you might use to promote some engagement. If I have students in my classroom, I would say typically if I have 30 students or less, I actually schedule a one-on-one meeting with each of those students within the first 3 weeks of class. It's a quick meeting, 10 minutes. So in that scenario, 30 students, 10 minutes each over a 3-week period. And I have a couple things I want to ask them. But what that does is it breaks down the barrier between me and that student. We get to know each other a little bit. I find out what they're interested in about the course. I might find out a little bit about them personally. And after doing that, I have far more attendance at my office hours. So that they are more likely to come to my office hours if I've broken down that barrier between them and me having a conversation. Oftentimes students are really intimidated by a faculty member, particularly if they're a first generation student. It's a very daunting thing to meet with a faculty member face to face. So by forcing them to do it, I break down that barrier and I create a space where they feel comfortable coming to me. So office hours increase, student engagement between me and that student increase. They're more willing to ask me a question via email too. And so that's one thing to just keep in mind as an option. Not feasible if you have a massive class. You might just make it optional, but it is certainly a strategy to consider. I like to do icebreakers at the beginning of a class session. Nobody likes icebreakers. There are very few people like icebreakers, but they do break the ice. They are very, very good at that. And so it forces students to come out of their comfort zone a little bit and actually participate. And then if I do that at the beginning of the class, they're far more likely to be comfortable participating as the class goes on and we actually get into the content. Another thing I've seen a faculty member do is at the beginning of every class, they share a random fact and give students a very small space at the beginning, maybe 5 minutes to just talk about it, or maybe a current event, something like that to break. It's kind of an icebreaker in and of itself. It just kind of breaks down that barrier to participation by having something that's low stakes. They're not getting graded on it, but they have that opportunity to participate. We used a poll at the beginning of this presentation. That's a great way to get student engagement as well. And for any of these, a student's camera wouldn't need to be on necessarily to show that they were participating. Student presentations, and lately with Zoom, we've been using breakout rooms where you might have different students presenting in each of those rooms and then students rotate between them. Sometimes if I have group work, I ask students to record their meetings so that if I need to go back and see who was participating, things of that nature with group work, I could have access to those recordings. And then another one that I'm a big fan of, using a shared document like Google Docs. If your campus uses Office 365, they have an option for this as well, but you can have a shared document and have students brainstorm or report out on that document. And so, thinking about how you might approach that Zoom session. Are you going to break students into groups? Is it going to be more of what we've been doing today, which is more, you talking to the students, but then asking for questions and feedback throughout. There's a lot of different approaches that you can do here, but I think all too often, what I saw in the pandemic anyway, is that in that emergency shift, faculty just did what they did in their classroom. And that does not always translate well to an online environment. Just doing, if you're the type of faculty member or instructor that lectures a lot, that doesn't always translate well to the online environment. And you have an opportunity in the online space that is afforded to you that wouldn't be in the face-to-face. That lecture could be pre-recorded. The nice thing about that is you do it once and you do it well, and then you don't have to do it again and again and again, semester to semester, and you can rethink what that synchronous together space looks like. Maybe now students watch the lecture before they come to the face-to-face synchronous Zoom session, and you have them break into groups and engage with the material in a way that you wouldn't have been able to do previously. When we think about groups, a couple things to consider. When I have had faculty have really successful group sessions with their students, they often assign roles. So each student, and those roles may rotate from session to session, but each student has a very specific thing that they are asked to do. We mentioned the Google Doc and reporting back. Alternately, when people come back, if you had assigned a role of reporter, that student might summarize what was discussed by actually speaking. And another thing that I've seen really useful, I've worked with a faculty member or two who have the students actually generate questions that are going to be discussed in the groups. And each week, a group of students or an individual student, depending on how many students you have and how many weeks you have, is responsible for generating the questions for that week based on the topic. And so that's a nice way to remove some of the burden on the instructor as well. I've also seen a lot of success with bringing in people to interview for a synchronous session who might be an expert in a field or an area that you're studying at that moment. And then students have the opportunity to actually ask that person questions. So that's a really great option if you have that type of connection with someone that you could bring in. They don't even necessarily, a lot of people who are out there in the field are willing, if you reach out to them, to come in and talk to your students. Especially if it's just a single class session. So a lot of different things you can do with groups in thinking through what your synchronous interaction is going to look like. All right, I want to talk about a couple of theories, and then we're going to do an activity together and open it up to questions for the last part of this. These couple of theories are incredibly useful, I've found, when you are thinking about how your students are going to interact and how you're going to present materials to your students. So the first is self-determination theory, and there's a lot on this screen. We don't need to read it all. If you're not familiar with self-determination theory, effectively, Deci and Ryan set up an autonomy continuum. On one end of the continuum, and this is all about motivation, on one end of the continuum, you have a motivation, meaning you're not motivated intrinsically to do something. So all things being equal, if you were asked to do this thing, but you weren't forced to, you're not going to do it. On the other end of the spectrum, you have intrinsic motivation. This is something you are already interested in. You're going to do it whether or not anyone asks you to, in all likelihood. In between that, we have extrinsic motivation. And so something is going to need to act on you to get you to do it. But you would do it potentially if something is acted upon you. Now, when you think about education, there are some things that we would be intrinsically motivated to learn about. It's probably, our major, things like that. But inherently, the system we have set up with assignments and assessments, it's kind of an extrinsic motivation. You're asking students to do certain things that they may not have done if you didn't ask them to. And so what I want to focus on is this end of the continuum. So as we have extrinsic motivation that is moving towards intrinsic motivation, what are the things we can do? How can we present things to students so that they are more likely to do them and be motivated to do those things? So Deci and Ryan lay out three main things to think about for that motivation to become more and more intrinsically motivated on that end of the continuum. The first is to create autonomy. So the feeling of choice. And we've talked about some strategies today about how you could create choice in your courses. You might offer multiple discussion prompt questions. We looked at that tic-tac-toe activity. Several of the alternate forms of assessment have choice kind of baked into them. So if you're having students create a portfolio, they have a lot of choice about how they're going to go about that, as opposed to taking a multiple choice test. Competence. So making sure that a student feels prepared and competent to do whatever it is you're asking. When we talked about course mapping and learning objectives and alignment and really making sure that you're setting students up for success, that the materials and the activities you're presenting them with help them achieve those learning objectives that they then get assessed on. That's all competence right there. And then relatedness. If you can have students feel related and personally invested, we talked about a lot of strategies there too. wherever possible with your discussion forum prompts, for example, creating the opportunity for students to share their own personal experiences or actively apply what it is that they're learning. Those are the types of things that will cause a student to feel related to the content and related to your course materials. When all three of these things happen, you actually have students become more motivated. So I share this with you just to kind of tie together some of the different things that we've talked about today, why they're appropriate strategies to create more engagement and more motivation from your students. The other theory that I think is really important to keep in mind is cognitive load theory. And we won't get into all the details of this, but effectively for students to be able to take on new information, for them to be able to take that information that's new and link it to existing information they already understand, you need to minimize extraneous load. And that is unnecessary, distracting information that doesn't really help students take in new information. So some things that I commonly see that are extraneous to a learning experience that you might decide to avoid would be a new technology for the technology's sake. So always keep in mind, if you're asking students to use a new technology that they haven't used before, they are not only having to learn the material you want them to learn for your subject matter, they're also having to learn this new technology. And that is a cognitive load burden. Often I see video where maybe I'm going over this slide deck with you, but my video is up in the upper right corner in a recording. A student now doesn't know whether to look at the screen or me in the corner. So that can sometimes create a little bit of a cognitive load burden. Similarly, if you've got a lot of things going on in a video, less likely probably if you're creating the video yourself, but if you're actually working with a professional to create video, sometimes that can distract from the content you want them to learn. And then the most common thing I see is that there's a lot of text on the screen, and then someone is talking over that text, and they're not necessarily talking about the specific text. For example, we just went through these bullet by bullet, but if that text had been there and I was talking about something completely different, you are now trying to read the text and listen to me. And that, of course, is going to create a cognitive load burden. There's a lot of strategies for how you can address that. You can pause and say, take a moment to read what's on the screen. You can say to students, if it's pre-recorded, please pause the video, read what's on the screen, and then unpause, and then you could start talking. Obviously, not having a lot of text on the slide is also a way to address that, or going through the text like we just did in a very structured fashion so that students don't feel like they need to read everything and listen to you. All right. So a couple of final thoughts. As we look at online and hybrid offerings, one of the things that excites me about them is that it creates more opportunities for flexibility and inclusive teaching practices. The reason I got into this field is because I wanted to provide more opportunities for students to engage with learning who might not have been able to otherwise. When you create asynchronous opportunities for students to learn, you're opening up doors to people that would not have been able to learn otherwise. And when I talk about inclusive teaching, and there are, by the way, the link I sent at the beginning, there's some resources around inclusive teaching, because that would be a whole other session in and of itself. But when I talk about inclusive teaching, it's thinking about everyone, thinking about race and culture, and thinking about gender and all of the different pieces of our identities and intersections that we have as people, and trying to create learning experiences that work for everyone. I want to stress the importance of organization and structure when you teach online in particular, because as we've talked about, students will often come to that situation a little bit lost. And so the more consistent the material is presented to students, the more guidance that you provide there, and the more organized your content is and thought out ahead of time, the better that learning experience is going to be for the student. I hesitate to say you can't communicate too much, because I think our students often are just getting overwhelmed with communication, but it is really important to communicate in an online environment. Again, students in a face-to-face environment would be able to raise their hand, they'd be able to ask a question, and everybody would hear that answer in the class. When you're in an online space, oftentimes you might get an email from an individual student, and you respond to that email, but not everybody else got the answer. So one strategy that I like to employ so as not to overwhelm my students is if I get an email from a student with a question, I have a specific forum that is for me to post that student's question and response. And I don't say who the student was, but that way everybody gets the benefit of hearing the response in case there are, in all likelihood, 2 or 3 other students that had that same question but didn't ask. And then lastly, we've gone over this several times today, but setting expectations is really crucial. Whether you're using rubrics, and there are some resources at the link I sent you for creating rubrics, by the way, whether you are simply just letting students know what it is that you expect of them. I think we've all been in a face-to-face class where a student has raised their hand and asked, what font size, how many pages, is it double spaced, what type of citation are we using? All of those things are expectations that you can set within the description of an assignment or an activity. And setting those expectations is actually going to save you a lot of time because you won't get as many questions from students about what it is you're asking them to do. So I'm going to throw one more URL into the chat. And if you could go to this link, there's 2 questions at this link. This is a Google document. If you could go to this link and you should all be able to go here and respond. There's 2 questions I'm curious about in this last 15 minutes. I thought we could have a little bit of discussion. And yes, I'll post that first link again. And this link is to the resources, including this slide deck. So the first question I have for you is, what has been your biggest challenge when you're trying to teach online? And then the second question is, we've attended this session today. We talked about some strategies. We talked about a lot of different things that can help improve your online learning experiences that you're creating. So is there anything that particularly excited you, or anything that you're thinking about incorporating to improve your course or to increase engagement with your students? So I'm going to let you all respond to these prompts. It looks like maybe some of you have had issues opening the links. There's a lot of people in here typing, so I think it's working for most people, but I'll be sure to share these links when it goes out so you can see maybe at a later time what people have shared and certainly contribute. And you all will continue to have access to this document, so it can be a space where you continue to collaborate and capture thoughts as it relates to this. I'm going to give you a couple more minutes, and then in the last 10 minutes, I thought we might just go through some of the things that have been shared and talk about some of the challenges that you faced, as well as anything that some of you may be interested in trying now that we've talked through some strategies. All right. Feel free to continue to type and add to this. I'm just going to hit a few of the high points. I think the disappearing student is certainly something that we all have struggled with in this space, particularly during the pandemic. So I would say if that has been your primary experience is the pandemic, that is less likely, although it still happens when we're not in a pandemic situation. There's a lot of things that might contribute to a student completely disengaging during the pandemic and everything else that was going on. You know, hopefully you've got some strategies for engaging students that won't be able to participate or that haven't been participating. Not having cameras on, I would say, is a pretty common theme I hear. I don't know that that is something that necessarily needs to be a requirement. It can be if you want your students to have their cameras on. You know, we talked about some of the considerations there. There are certainly activities you can create to have students still demonstrate that they're engaging, even if their cameras aren't on. Definitely too much prep, I hear a lot. If your university doesn't have resources to support you, please keep in mind that, as we've talked about throughout the session today, bite off what you're capable of taking on. Don't try to do too much. Small incremental improvements is the name of the game here. Yeah. Okay. So we called it high flex or hybrid at times, but yes, there is a scenario where you're teaching students online and you're also teaching students in the class at the exact same time. That is really challenging. And, you know, there's a lot of different models for how to do that. But let me just say that one of the most important things is the technology in the room. And that can be really challenging, particularly if your institution doesn't have the funding to really set up a good space for that type of high flex. And so what you may have to do in those situations is really think through what those two learning experiences will look like. They're not going to be the same, especially if you don't have the technology. You know, those two experiences don't have to be the same, but ideally they would be comparable. Students would still be able to learn the same things, but you may need to think through exactly how that works in your unique situation. Yeah, so I think it's commendable that you actually did change your teaching strategies in that next bullet. I think all too often that wasn't the case. I know it was likely very difficult to do that, but hopefully you have some ideas for some alternate forms of assessments. Yeah, and I think again a lot of comments around students not participating. You know, we talked through some strategies today to get students to participate, but also keep in mind, grain of salt, this was a pandemic, and I don't think participation will necessarily look the same once we move past the pandemic and have some online offerings. And hopefully, without the pandemic and the rush to move online, you would also have more time to prepare and think through some activities that might increase participation. And yeah, our students were overwhelmed. We were overwhelmed. I think the biggest takeaway, one of them anyway, that I had was just the need for us all to show compassion to each other in this time, but students for their teachers, teachers for their students, students to each other. So poor quality internet is a huge issue, particularly if you were trying to do some type of synchronous activity. For that reason, if poor quality internet continues to be a problem, one of the things that I would encourage you to do is provide asynchronous and synchronous alternatives. So for example, if I had a synchronous session, I would record that and then I would post it online, just in case my students lost internet or for whatever reason, especially with everything that was going on during the pandemic, for whatever reason, they weren't able to attend that synchronous session. That way they could still engage with the material and learn when they were in a situation where they had more reliable internet. Another strategy I know that UNC and some other schools used was to set up some spaces where internet was available and students could drive to that space and connect from their cars. And I know a lot of businesses were doing that as well. Libraries and some other businesses were offering that as a service because, you know, so many people had to go back home, and home doesn't always have the most reliable internet. So some great things here. It looks like a number of things people are planning on trying as well. So doing the brief office meeting at the start to try to connect with your students, the setting expectations. Yeah, take care of yourself. Set feasible limits for yourself. You cannot do it all. It's true. Yep, the engaging prompts. Hopefully what we talked about today will help you think about how to create forums that actually will generate conversation and discourse. Open-ended questions. The self-determination theory and cognitive load theory. Icebreakers. I didn't do an icebreaker with you all today because there were just too many of us, but you got off the hook. Awesome. Again, you'll continue to have access to this document and you can continue to add to it. Hopefully seeing some of the things that your colleagues struggled with lets you know this was a shared experience. We all had those struggles. I will guarantee you the faculty I worked with here at UNC Chapel Hill had these same struggles. This was a globally shared experience. And hopefully some of the things you see your colleagues considering improving in their course might inspire you to do some of the same. So question about rising fuel prices and awareness, you know, about viruses and pandemics increasing students looking to online options. I think honestly, independent of those things, just the fact that we all had to do it online and we demonstrated that it's possible. There's a lot of people who, faculty in particular, who dip their toe in this who never would have. And I've talked to faculty who, you know, who have told me directly they never would have taught an online class, but now that's all they want to teach. That's not everyone, and particularly with some of the struggles we had that we just went through. But there are people who will try it now who wouldn't have. I think institutions that might not have made this a priority were forced to. We're going to see more online offerings. We're going to see a lot of change. You know, I think more and more people are going to be able to work remotely. I think a lot of people lost their job, and this was an opportunity for them to take online classes and skill up. And so I think across the board, we're going to see more online and hybrid offerings. If nothing else, the hybrid component where faculty had to try some things, they're now happy that they have used the LMS that they maybe never had used before, and they'll use that in their face-to-face class now. They'll provide more resources online, things of that nature. I'm seeing a lot of faculty planning to flip their classroom, pre-record their lectures, and do something different in the physical class space. You will receive the recording of the webinar along with the links that I provided. And yes, I definitely think that online learning is a better fit for adult learners. Online learning requires a lot of self-discipline. You really need to be organized in your own thinking, and you need to be motivated to actually engage with the material. Obviously, from a design standpoint, we can optimize our courses to increase the likelihood that will happen. But independent of that, a online student needs to, it's a different type of experience, learning experience. And you really do need to be motivated. And it asks a lot of our students in addition to our faculty. So that's not a great fit for most children So it's not that it's impossible. There's certainly ways that younger students can learn online. I don't know that it's a great solution in place of a typical classroom. You can look at things like Khan Academy. That's a great supplement for maybe a younger learner who needs a little bit of help with a specific subject area. And that's something they can engage with at home or with their parents. But in terms of what we saw during the pandemic, shifting, say, a first grade kindergarten class here in the United States to online, it was very, very difficult and not the same experience we had with our adult learners. We are at time. I want to be cognizant of that with everyone. I'm happy to stick around and continue to answer questions from anyone that wants to, but I appreciate you having us today. I hope this was helpful.
Thank you, Paul. This was incredibly helpful. And I also want to thank everybody for their engagement. Really appreciate you taking the time to engage with us and do this. You covered a lot in a short period of time, but in ways that are engaging and clear. Thank you so much. So you know something about teaching online, so that's good.
Yeah, and we will try to make this available to everybody at a later stage. I don't know if we'll be able to share the link to the video because it's a huge, but we will find the ways to do it. Thank you very much. Okay.
Thank you all. Thanks, Paul, Todd, Salma. Have a great day.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you very much. It was really inspiring. Thank you.
Thank you, Fuad, for being available to us and doing it on the spot when we asked for it.
Oh, anytime. It's easy for me. It's Todd and Paul who did the heavy lifting. Thank you so much. I appreciate it. And you all have a great day.
Thank you.
Or night.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Night.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody, for attending with us. I hope you enjoyed the session.